Breaking news. Russia has lost the most from the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, while Azerbaijan and Turkey have emerged victorious. Russia played a key role in mediating a ceasefire between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which averted a major conflict on Europe's southeastern borders. The Russians, who have about 12,000 troops stationed in the area, are also assisting in peace talks between the opposing sides. Despite its public profile, Russia stands to lose the most from the current flare-up, as the fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia shows how vulnerable the Russians are after their failed military invasion of Ukraine. Despite both countries gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan has persisted. Nagorno-Karabakh is a landlocked mountainous region of Azerbaijan that is home to roughly 120,000 ethnic Armenians, and its fate has become the focal point of the conflict between the two neighbors. The Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh declared independence from Azerbaijan long before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over the past 3 decades, Nagorno-Karabakh has openly been supported by Armenia and has operated as a de facto independent state, despite the fact that the international community has never recognized this. Russia found it convenient that the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute dragged on for so long, as it did with other so-called frozen conflicts in the former Soviet space, because it allowed Russian leaders to maintain their influence in the region. Russia supported Armenia to the fullest extent up until recently, and it maintained key military bases in the country. Azerbaijan, despite being much wealthier thanks to its oil and natural gas reserves, was still unable to reclaim its former territory from Armenia. With Russia's tacit support, Armenian separatists have refused to negotiate with Azerbaijan for the past 30 years, increasing their occupation of Azeri territory. Turkey's entry into the conflict, however, shifted the strategic dynamic. Since the Azeris are linguistically and culturally close to the Turks, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey received widespread support for his plan to train and equip the Azerbaijani military. Mr. Erdogan's plan worked wonderfully. In 2020, a revitalized Azeri military used lightning strikes to inflict serious blows on Armenia, but the Russians, preoccupied with their military deployments in neighboring Syria and their growing confrontation with the West, were too preoccupied to respond. When the Russians became mired in Ukraine in 2022, it was widely understood that the Azeris would soon launch another attack on Nagorno-Karabakh in an effort to completely eradicate the insurgency there. After months of Azeri economic pressure, the enclave was unprepared to defend itself when the offensive began as scheduled this week. Armenia was helpless to do anything about it. Even when a Russian military outpost was bombed, the Russian military did nothing. This effectively means that the Armenian separatists in Nagorno-Karabakh have surrendered. The Russian-mediated ceasefire agreement calls for all military formations in Nagorno-Karabakh to disarm, their quasi-state structures to be dismantled, and negotiations to reintegrate the territory back into Azerbaijan. President Ilham Aliyev of Azerbaijan has denied reports that Armenians living in the enclave are being threatened with expulsion. The people of Karabakh who are Armenian can relax now. We harbor no animosity toward them. They are our citizens, Mr. Aliyev declared in a televised address to his country. There was, however, no denying his ultimate success. Azerbaijan's sovereignty is restored in the region, Mr. Aliyev went on to say. There was also no question about the severity of the Russian loss. Russian officials are trying to shift the blame by saying the Armenian government has abandoned Nagorno-Karabakh, but the fact remains that Moscow has now publicly admitted that it does not have the time or resources to defend Armenia, its regional proxy. The Russians' influence in the region also appears destined to decline further. Nikol Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, is in jeopardy after this week's events. He stands accused of recklessly risking Nagorno-Karabakh for political gain. The Armenian capital of Yerevan has already heard calls for a coup or a revolution. But if Mr. Pashinyan does make it out of this alive, he will be pressured to break ties with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in a rush to restore his credibility by reminding everyone that Moscow will lead future negotiations over the implementation of the ceasefire agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Mr. Putin stated that the Russian peacekeeping contingent's leadership would mediate the talks. However, the Azeris and the Turks who support them are now the clear leaders of the region. Another example of the enormous strategic cost Russia must pay for its adventures in Ukraine.